we come to today's speaker, Roger Underwood. Stand up, Roger. Roger is a graduate of the University of Western Australia, moved straight into forestry and has occupied a vast range of positions within the forestry area. He's been involved in forestry policy, forestry management, and he's had a fair hand in control burning from the air. And he's going to be talking about that today first up. So he's our main speaker today. Roger, it's all yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. The subject links together two things that have long fascinated me. A, aircraft, and B, bushfire management. Before doing so, I hasten to add that I'm not a pilot, although I've done a lot of bush flying in my time. On the other hand, I have been involved in forestry and in bushfire management going back for 50 years now. I started my career in a fire gang at Dwellingup in 1958, in the first summer after I left school. And although these days I work mostly as an independent advisor on forestry and fire, I did spend 30 years at the front, and in my early career I worked as a forester in many parts of the southwest. I was 10 years as the DFO at Pemberton and 5 years in charge of fire protection for the whole of the Karri Forest. There are three themes I want to talk to you about today: aerial burning, aerial fire spotting and aerial fire suppression. But before starting to talk about aircraft, I want to step back one pace and just set the scene by talking a little bit about fire. The first settlers and the early foresters in Western Australia brought with them a European attitude to bushfires. This was the idea that all fires are evil and damaging. Thus their response was one of rapid detection and rapid suppression. I call this the fire brigade approach. In the early days of forestry, beginning back in the 1920s, fire control therefore involved the construction of fire lookout towers and the location of gangs of men throughout the southwest who could rush to a fire the moment it was detected. The idea of using fire to fight fire was completely rejected by early settlers and early foresters. With their European training and their European mindset, they could not conceive of the idea of a forest in which fire was a natural factor. What they forgot or did not know was that the Aborigines had been burning the bush regularly for many thousands of years, and the bush was thoroughly well adapted, indeed thrived on mild and frequent fire. Now the fire brigade approach, as I call it, is quite appropriate for the rural countryside of England, but it does not work in Australian forests. Firstly, and obviously, fire conditions are much worse here than in England. We have a hot, dry summer every summer. We have frequent droughts. We have lightning strikes. Secondly, the Australian eucalypt forests accumulate bushfire fuel. The leaves, twigs and branches don't just rot away when they fall to the ground, as they do in the temperate forests of Europe. In the absence of fire, the litter builds up continually over the years, and there could be 30 tonnes to every hectare of dry fuel on an acre, a hectare of jarrah forest. Bushfires in heavy forest fuels are virtually impossible to control, especially under windy conditions, which lead to a fire crowning and throwing spot fires miles ahead. There's no force of firefighters on earth that can control a crown fire such as this one. It took many years and many disasters for Australians to realise that they were living in Australia and not England, and that the fire brigade approach by itself does not and will not work. The big lesson in WA was learned in 1961 when several towns and hundreds of thousands of hectares of forest and farmland went up in smoke in a period of a few hours. The fires were burning in long, heavy, unburnt bush, and control action failed. This led to a Royal Commission and to a change in official policy and the introduction of prescribed burning by the Forest Department. Prescribed burning is the deliberate burning off of the bush under mild conditions, so that instead of an inferno in midsummer, you have quiet fires that burn up the litter and other fuels on the forest floor, but do no damage to the environment. This is a photograph of a mild prescribed burn in the Wandoo forest, and it's typical of the sorts of fires that we're talking about when we talk about prescribed burning. But it was one thing for the Forest Department to introduce this new policy, it was another to implement it. Originally, prescribed burns were lit from the ground by gangs of men walking through the bush with drip torches. The technique was called hand burning, and although it was effective in reducing fuels, it was inefficient, costly, and in some cases, especially down in the dense forests of the Karri country, it was very dangerous. The story is now well told that two brilliant young fire researchers, George Peat of the Forest Department and David Packham of CSIRO, were discussing this situation over a beer in the Manjimup pub one night. Packham was not just a brilliant scientist, but he was also a pilot. Bingo! The great idea was born: aerial burning. The idea was simple. An aircraft would fly over the forest, dropping incendiaries, and the flight pattern would mimic the grid lines used in hand burning, but it could be done on a much larger scale. However, having the good idea was not enough. There were many things that were needed to be perfected. The first was to design an incendiary. It had to be something that was non-explosive and safe to carry in the aircraft. In the end, the solution again was very ingenious. A small plastic phial about this size would be filled with a few grams of Condy's crystals, or potassium permanganate. The phial would be injected with a syringe with a few cc's of liquid glycol, and then ejected from the aircraft through a venturi. Several seconds would elapse while the capsule tumbled to the ground, and in that time there would be a chemical reaction between the two reagents in the phial, which would start a fire. And by the time the capsule had landed on the dry leaves on the ground, it would burst into flame with an intense heat which would set the leaves on fire. Packham also designed a bombing machine into which the capsules could be fed and then injected with glycol and ejected from the aeroplane. It had a timing device so that the bombardier could manipulate the distance apart of the spot fires, given that the speed of the aircraft was known and held steady. Every burn had to be very carefully planned. Many decisions had to be taken, most of them in a brief time as soon as we had the 0745 weather forecast. If the forecast was right and we got the nod and the aircraft was ours for a burn, we would then decide the direction of the flight lines, how far apart they would be, and the spot distance to drop the capsules along the lines. A flight plan would be drawn up and sent to the airstrip for the aircrew, with copies to the marker vehicles, who had to mark the ends of each flight line. Ground crews would be organised and staff given various assignments and sectors to look after. Flight line number 1 would always commence on the downwind side of the block, and we would fly the bombing lines across the wind. The plane would fly at a height of about 600 feet above ground level, which was equivalent to about 250 feet above the tops of the trees in the southern Karri forest. The flight lines would usually be about 250 to 350 metres apart, and the spot distance about half the flight line width. Using fire behaviour tables, we could calculate the rate of spread of each spot fire, and we would set it up so that the whole area would burn out by about nightfall of the day of the burn. The fires would be mild, with flames less than a metre height, although this could vary across the burn. Some places would burn slightly more intensely, others would be left unburnt. Inside the aeroplane there was a 3-man crew. There was the pilot on the left at the front. He was responsible for keeping the plane steady, the nominated speed constant, and dead on the flight lines. There was the navigator sitting next to him, who was also the skipper of the mission, and he controlled the whole operation from beside the pilot. And then there was the bombardier sitting in front of the bombing machine, which you can see there, and the trays of capsules to his right. The bombing machine originally was a manual operation with a manual injection of the syringe into each capsule, but after a while it became automated, and the bombardier's job was simply to fit the capsules into the slot. They would then be injected and later ejected. As they crossed the boundary into a burn, the navigator would say, "Commence, commence," and the bombardier would start the bombing machine spitting out its capsules. At the other end of the line, the reverse applied. Occasionally, the local district forester would come along as an observer, and I did this many times in the early days. But mostly I would fill the role of the controller on the ground. It was my job to plan the burn, decide on the lighting pattern, organise all the troops, give the okay to start, and then take the blame if things went wrong. The beginning and the end of each flight line were marked by line marking crews travelling in a Land Rover. They had a copy of the flight plan with the distances between each line marked on it. In the early days, when they got to the appointed point, they would unwind a ball of string with a helium balloon on it. But this was a slow, frustrating and very inefficient device. The balloons would get caught in the branches of trees or drift off in the wind. And on one occasion, the man holding the string was attacked by a tiger snake and lost his grip. After a while, we started using an RDF device, which was fitted in the Land Rover and connected by radio beam to a receiver in the plane. This provided the pilot with both a foresight and a backsight. In the early days, the ground crews also used to have a very pistol, and they would fire a flare to give the pilot a confirmation sighting. Ground-to-air communications in the early days, in the mid-60s, were very difficult, if non-existent. But within a few years, we had VHF radio and then radio telephone, and this provided a huge improvement. On the ground, we would listen to and follow the whole operation from the control point, and we would hear a conversation going on a bit like this. North marker to aircraft in position on line 6. Roger North, fire flare. Aircraft to north, flare sighted. Navigator to bombardier, commence, commence. A few minutes silence and then, stop, stop. South marker to aircraft in position on line 7. Roger South, stand by. And so on for the 2 or 3 hours that the burn took place. Our first bombing aircraft in the early days was a Cessna 337, Romeo Zulu Oscar. This was what I used to call a push-me-pull-you machine, but I understand the pilots used to call it a suck-blow machine because it was a stumpy, high-wing, 2-engine machine, one engine facing forward and the other backward. It was a departmental rule in the early days that all forestry planes must be 2-engine in case of an engine failure, as there were few airstrips or emergency landing places in the forest country. This particular aircraft was believed to have been owned by the Swan Brewery. I consider this to be very appropriate given the consumption of beer by our aircrew, especially after a long and difficult mission. By the way, the 2-engine safety measure was good in theory. Unfortunately, Romeo Zulu Oscar failed its first and only test. During a burn near Margaret River, one engine cut out and could not be restarted. That's okay, said Ken Jones, the pilot. We still have one engine left. However, it was soon discovered that with 4 large people on board, the bombing machine, the trays of capsules, the bottles of glycol and the special fire extinguishers, the plane could only just fly on one engine, and indeed it couldn't even climb, it could only descend. Disaster was imminent, but Jones and his navigator Mike Rowell had a clever idea. They headed for the coast near Augusta, and as soon as they got out over the Southern Ocean and the air temperature dropped, the overheated engine cooled and could be restarted. They were a height of about 100 feet at the time and heading for the drink. Following this incident, the department decided to use a more modern aircraft and went over to the B-55 Beechcraft Baron. 2 of these were used, Charlie Foxtrot Oscar and Charlie Foxtrot Golf. They were fitted with the 2nd generation bombing machine, which had completely automatic capsule priming. The Baron was a fast and beautiful aeroplane. The aircrew loved it, but I hated flying in it. The observer always sat right at the back, behind the bombardier, almost in the tail. The turns at the end of each flight line would be extremely tight. As soon as the navigator called stop, stop to the bombardier, signifying the end of the flight line, the pilot would pull up steeply and then perform a manoeuvre they called a semi-slide slip turn, slewing around to start on the next turn, the next line. I hated this and I always used to get sick in the Baron. I'll never forget one time coming back from a large aerial burn down near the Gardner River south of Northcliffe, in which I had sat in the back of the Baron as an observer, as sick as a dog for the whole proceedings. We landed at the Manjimup airstrip and I set off to drive home to Pemberton. I got as far as Diamond Tree, a couple of kilometres down the road, and had to pull off. I went and lay on the ground under some bracken ferns, completely debilitated. It was 2 hours before I could get up and get back in my car and drive home. The Barron had other disadvantages. It was just slightly too fast to handle small and tricky burns with a sufficient margin of error. I remarked to Harry earlier that I can remember when I flew with them, the stall warning buzzer used to be going all the time during an aerial burn when they were flying in the Barron. And the difficulty was that it went so fast that it was hard for the pilot and for the navigator to know where they'd come to the end or what was going on. And I well remember one burn in heavy carry forest down near Quinnanup when I was the controller on the ground. The navigator misjudged his run on the first flight line and he put about 100 capsules on the wrong side of the boundary. This meant we had a line of fire burning with the wind behind it instead of into it. It took us 2 days to put that fire out. Although of course this sounds worse than it was, as the fire on the wrong side was still burning under quite mild conditions. I found out later that the navigator had caught a flash of sunlight reflected from the iron roof of a distant farmhouse and mistaken this for the very pistol flare. But by the time he and the pilot had corrected onto the RDF beacon, it was too late. The Barron also used to have trouble getting down on the little bush bits around the place, particularly the one at Walpole, which was extremely hazardous, or the forestry strip at Shannon River, which was always covered with kangaroos. Just about at that time, one of our pilots mentioned an aircraft called a British Normand Islander, which he thought might be available. We tried it and we found it was just a shot. It could fly at walking speed, get up and down off a cricket pitch, and was high winged, so that the visibility for pilot and navigator was unimpeded. The department contracted 2 islanders, India Sierra Alpha and Charlie Papa Golf, and they were our main bombing aircraft for nearly 21 years. They were also used for the dieback photography program, where their low speed and stability made them a perfect photographic platform. The Islanders were only superseded quite recently with the advent of helicopters for aerial burning. I love the Islanders. I learnt to fly in them and never once got sick in one. I was present on the ground 1965 when the very first aerial burn was done in Western Australia, and later I was responsible for the first generation of all the aerial burns in the Carry country. It was technically very challenging, but we got there in the end. I always gave top marks to our navigators. Most of these were not trained airmen, but field foresters who had high quality map reading skills, could think fast and had iron guts. Often they would do 2 missions a day, each taking 2 or 3 hours, and this demanded exceptional concentration and physical endurance. There were many technical issues that we had to resolve as we went along, especially in the early years. The first VHF set still had valves rather than transistors. They took ages to warm up and then they would burn out with overuse. That great pioneering navigator Mike Rowell once burnt out 3 VHF sets in one day. There was also the question of radio language, I remember. When aerial burning commenced in the mid-60s, the Forest Department was still using the old British wartime language, Alpha Baker, etc., whereas all the pilots used the new international system, Alpha Bravo and so on. In the end, the department had to change, although it was over the dead body of our communications chief, Cliff Pincus. Cliff had been in the RAF during the war and he was a traditionalist to his bootstraps. Another problem we had was that the pilots were used to measuring speed in knots, whereas foresters only knew about miles per hour. I remember how difficult, indeed almost impossible, we found it to convert from knots to chains per second on the back of an envelope, as we had no calculators in those days. Coordinating flying speed with the correct setting on the bombing machine was absolutely critical because it determined the distance of the spots along the flight lines. Looking back, the truly amazing thing is that this entirely new and innovative system was taken from conception to operational efficiency in a period of less than 10 years and without a single casualty. Today, aerial burning is taken for granted. The second great forestry aerial operation in which I was involved was the advent of aerial fire spotting. Up until the 1970s, all of the fire detection in WA forests was done from static lookout towers. These were linked to each other and to district headquarters by the Forest Department's single wire earth return telephone system. The lookout towers were manned 7 days a week and 8 to 9 hours a day all through the fire season. Each tower was equipped with a sighting vane and a compass rose so that the lookout man could take a bearing on a smoke, estimate its distance and then telephone through to headquarters with the information. Back at HQ, we would triangulate the bearings from the different towers to try and position the exact coordinates of the fire. In the karri country, you will all know, the lookouts were actually on the tops of tall karri trees. Now this system worked well when the visibility was good and the country was not too hilly. But when there was lots of smoke around and many fires, or if a fire started way down in a steep valley, it could be ages before we knew about it. Furthermore, towermen were not always completely reliable, especially late in the summer, and they began to suffer from a form of loneliness and depression that we called towerman syndrome. In 1972, the department's fire expert George Peake went on a study tour to North America, and there he observed the use of light aircraft in fire spotting. On his return, I was the DFO at Pemberton at the time, I was asked to institute a trial in the Pemberton district. We hired a Cessna 150 and a young pilot called Jim McMahon, known to us all as Spotter Jim. We gave him detailed training and fitted him up with special ortho photo maps and reporting protocols. I designed a flight circuit that would give him a 1 hour round turnaround and a schedule of flights that increased or decreased according to the weather. I also flew with Jim on umpteen flights, teaching him the local geography and information about fire. For 3 months we ran the spotter aircraft and our traditional fire lookout system in parallel, and then we analysed and compared the results. These were very complicated and I won't bore you with all the details, but overall the advantage fell to the aircraft. In general, we found that the towers would see a smoke first, but then there would be a delay while they determined the position of the fire with the bearings from the other towers. On the other hand, the aircraft would give us precise coordinates on the fire at his first report, and in addition, he could provide a preliminary analysis of the fire and how serious the situation looked. Previously, we'd had to wait sometimes for up to an hour to get our first reports, having to wait for ground crews to get to the fire, do a reconnoitre and report in. So that first trial was so promising that the following year we ran a full-scale operational trial over the full fire season, and it was an outstanding success. From then on, aircraft steadily took over for fire detection, not only throughout southwestern WA, but the idea caught on and is now used in Victoria, New South Wales and Tasmania. The lookout towers are still maintained, by the way, and still used under high fire danger conditions, giving us in one of the world's best forest fire detection systems in WA. The little Cessna's 150s are no longer used. In fact, I thought they were obsolete when I was flying in them. The tinny sound the door made when you shut it always put me in mind of a 1940s Ford Prefect. Later we used Piper Cubs, and then for a time the locally built Eagle, before finally settling on a plane called the American Scout, now considered to be the Princess Spotter aircraft. The job of the fire spotting pilot is very demanding. He usually works alone. He has to fly a predetermined circuit, keep watch for smokes in all directions, navigate, plot smokes onto a map, fill in report forms while flying, and keep track of all the different smokes so that if he spots a new one, he can head straight for it. The spotter pilots are also required to give weather reports, note wind changes, and report anything suspicious, like a vehicle roaring away from a deliberately lit fire. All of them are well aware that they are flying a single-engine aircraft over dense forest, often at treetop height. In the early days, most of our spotter pilots were new young pilots with brand new wings, looking for an opportunity to work up their hours. Some of them were more of a problem than a help. I remember having to sack one pilot. I gave him a warning one day after he dropped a letter in a bottle to his girlfriend, who was hop picking in the Bunn's hop gardens along with about 40 other women. But the final straw came one day when he performed a series of aerobatics at rooftop height over Manjimup townsite one Sunday afternoon in our aeroplane. Later, the department developed a cadre of spotter pilots who did the job year in and year out and became a highly respected part of the organisation, totally reliable and with an intimate knowledge of their patch. They became the equivalent of the old lookout men of earlier days, iconic figures in the forestry family. I can only really remember one serious emergency during my years on the job, out of many thousands of hours flown by the spotter aircraft. One of our spotter pilots took off from a bush trip near Yanchep one morning, and the engine cut out almost immediately he was airborne. Luckily, he was able to get down and land on the Wanneroo-Yanchep road. We found out later that someone had come in during the night and milked all the avgas out of his tanks. When I asked him why he took off without checking his fuel gauge, he gave me one of the great all-time answers. In the Cessna 150, he said, you cannot see the needle on the fuel gauge when the tanks are completely full or completely empty. He had filled up the night before, and when he got in the next morning and looked at the gauge and couldn't see the needle, he assumed the tanks were full. I found out from another pilot that dipping the tanks before takeoff was a long recognised protocol which this young man apparently had never been taught. No doubt the old flyers in this room today will nod agreement. The final evolution of aircraft in bushfire management has been the advent of the water bomber. Originally, we experimented with the use of fire retardant chemicals rather than water because fresh water is so precious in WA in the summertime. The retardant chemical would be dropped as a powder in the bush in front of the head fire. The idea was that when the fire reached the bush with the retardant on it, fire intensity would drop and the gangs on the ground could get in and do some work. I attended many trials of this fire retardant dropping and I never saw it have any effect whatsoever on fire behaviour. I think it worked in Northern Hemisphere conifer forests, but it just wasn't the right thing for the sort of fires we got in Australian eucalypt forests. Moreover, the use of chemicals had environmental problems, especially in water catchment areas. Today, helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft are used and they all drop water. I consider water bombing to be worthwhile for assisting ground crews on grass fires and when defending a house, but is a complete waste of time, money and water in the control of intense forest fires. Many of you would have seen TV shots of the futile water bombing during the Victorian bushfires on TV earlier this year. Most of the precious water evaporated well before it hit the ground because of the intense heat below. Water bombers, of course, are beloved by politicians and journalists, so it does not matter that they are often completely ineffective. They look impressive on the TV and that seems to be all that matters. Modern fire management has come to be built around them, despite their expense and their inefficiency. Unfortunately, a new generation of forest and fire managers is now coming into the business in Australia who are reverting to what I called the European fire brigade approach. It was long ago rejected by foresters, but is preferred by the environmentalists who are paranoid about prescribed burning. For many years, the environmentalists have called the shots in Australian politics, so you cannot argue with it. The consequence of their policy, however, was shown up to nobody's surprise in Victoria this year, the return to massive bushfires. To conclude, I was privileged to work with some fantastic characters in my association with aerial forestry. Mike Rowell, Jerry Van Didden, the first two Navigator bombers, they did a magnificent job. Kevin White, John Mackenzie were superb navigators. The most memorable pilot I ever knew was the Honourable Anthony Edgerton Green. Tony started with us in the early 70s as a spotter pilot, but graduated to fly the Islander on aerial burning and photographic missions. He was already well into his 60s by then. He'd been in the RAF, a fighter pilot flying a Spitfire in the war, spoke in a beautiful upper crust English accent, was always immaculately dressed, had a handlebar moustache and a gap between his front teeth. I used to think he was the fighter pilot from Central Casting. It was Tony who taught me to fly, first in the Cessna 150 and then in the Islander. although I noticed that he always had his hands and feet on the controls while I was doing so. Tony was a very laid-back character, the most laid-back I ever met. I think he thought aerial burning and fire spotting was pretty casual compared to what he'd been doing in earlier years. I only ever once saw him look anxious. He and I had flown back from Walpole to Manjimup one day from a job down there, but when we got to Manjimup, the whole district was socked in under dense smoke and we couldn't find the airstrip. "It's got to be down there somewhere," said Tony, and down he went through the smoke. Eventually we broke into the clear to find ourselves about 30 feet off the ground and flying between huge old ringbark carry trees on farmland out near Dean Mill. I had not known previously that people could actually turn white underneath a tan, or that the old islander had such a fantastic rate of climb. On another occasion, my mate Bob Chandler was flying with Tony at the usual leisurely pace in the islander, not far above the treetop height, when an RAAF F-111 fighter bomber streaked through, flying between Tony and the treetops. "Cheeky young bugger," said Tony, his thumb closing on an imaginary firing button on the joystick. These days, aircraft in various shapes and sizes are as much a part of bushfire and forest management as are jeeps and fire trucks. Although in my view the water bombers are grossly overrated, the fire spotters and the aerial burning aircraft still do a magnificent job. In both aerial burning and in fire spotting, WA led the nation and in some cases the world, pioneering new techniques that have stood the test of time. The aircraft burning program that we instituted during the 60s, 70s and 80s saved West Australians and our forests and our towns from the ravages of massive bushfires over and over and over again. Despite this, it is indicative of the times that we could never get a program like that off the ground today. The environmentalists would object, describing it as fire-bombing rare and fragile ecosystems, and the politicians would crumble. The media would crucify us for every little problem. Yes, we did make errors as we moved along and upward on the learning curve, but I believe we did a great job, even if I say so myself. We were very lucky to be working in an era when the media was looking for heroes, not villains, and people were prepared to have a go, to tolerate errors in the early phase of a new program, and to work towards the greater community good, rather than bowing meekly to the demands of a bleating minority. I was proud to have been part of it, to have known and worked with so many great men and so many fascinating aircraft. Thank you very much.